All right, we're recording now. So how's it going, AV? Do you have audio for me? Good. Okay. Excellent. My name is Dr. Clark Holdsworth. Some of you are returning to this webinar. Some of you are new. So today's webinar for this part of the series is producing an engaging scientific webinar, expert tips and best practices. I have Dr. Adriel Lichardi here with me as usual. I'm actually going to start by just going through how these webinars work for you a little bit. I'll give my background, then we'll bring AV in. She'll give you some background and we can get started on our content. So the way this is going to work for us, just a few housekeeping items. First off, this is recording, as you saw when I first started in. We are, in fact, recording it, which is something we'll talk about for the topic today. So this will be on demand. So what's going to happen is you are going to get a follow-up email after this session. You'll get a link to the on-demand recording for this. So that way, if you have to cut out or anything, can't make it all the way through, you'll have access to it. You can also feel free to share that up with others, colleagues, students, anything like that. There's probably certainly other people that you know that would benefit from this topic. In addition, what you're also going to get in that email is a certificate of completion. I know that's important for some of you. You can use that for some certain requirements that you may have. So you will get a certificate of completion. Again, this follow-up is going to come to you within 24 hours. So if after 24 hours you haven't received that, feel free just to send us a follow-up email and we can make sure you get a link to that recording. But just be patient within those first 24 hours because it should come out automated. In terms of this webinar, for the platform, what I just want to draw your attention to is you have the chat down here at the bottom where you can message to all panelists and attendees throughout the session. Feel free to use that. More importantly, you'll notice that you have a Q&A function down there. So go ahead and click on that. You can see that you'll leave your questions there for us. We actually have a pretty small pool of participants today, so it shouldn't be too hard to get through all of your questions, but it's very helpful to have them all in that Q&A section. You can also go ahead and upvote questions there. I'm sure many of you will have similar questions. So in order just to get the ones that you want answered, just go ahead and upvote ones that are consistent with yours or that you also want an answer to, and we'll address those first. Other than that, I think we're good for housekeeping items. So I'm just going to briefly introduce myself. As I said, I'm Dr. Clark Holdsworth. I'm the Senior Manager, Communications and Partnerships at LetPub. I, like Dr. Lichardi, come from an academic background. So my previous work was in physiology. I was at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Kansas State University. My focus there was primarily preclinical models, and we were interested mostly in vascular control, studying all the control of O2 gradients from the higher gradients at ambient air all the way down to the very, very low PO2s in the muscle myoglobin. And we focused primarily on models of dysfunction, so chronic congestive heart failure, emphysema, type 2 diabetes, these types of things. So I do have a little bit of background in life sciences. You'll see from Dr. Lichardi that she has a very different background, which I think is quite helpful, getting both perspectives here. So unless I missed anything, AV, I'm going to let you come in and introduce yourself as well.
All right, well, thank you, Clark. And is my audio okay? You want to give me a shout out?
Looks good.
All right, awesome. So as Clark said, my name is Dr. Adriel Lichardi, or AV for short. My background is indeed a little bit different from his, but we are both from the academic realm. I got my master's and my PhD in geology and the geological sciences. I studied a similar broad topic with both my degrees, focusing on reconstructing past glacier change to identify how sensitive glaciers are going to be moving forward in the future with climate change on Earth. I use a variety of different techniques, focusing on anything from glacial geology and geomorphology to geochronology and remote sensing techniques as well. I did all this before jumping ship to scholarly publishing, where I'm very much engaged in educational outreach, such as doing these webinars, some of the educational articles that we have on our website each month. So if you have not seen those, please check those out, and a variety of other tasks. And today I'm very excited to welcome everybody to the webinar, and Clark and I are very happy that you're here. And again, if you have any questions related to the content today, please don't hesitate to ask. So with that, I think we want to jump into the content today. Clark, do you have anything else that you want to touch on before we get rolling?
No, just I would mention though, it's nice if you guys throw your questions in now. I'm sure plenty of you had questions coming into this, so feel free to throw them in the Q&A early. You don't have to wait right to the end. Makes it easier for us to plan how we're going to go through those.
All right, sounds good. So for today's webinar, as Clark mentioned, the topic is how to run an effective webinar. And while we might say webinar a lot throughout this presentation, what we really want is to provide all of you information on how to do online instruction as effectively as possible. So this includes, of course, webinars, but any sort of online courses that you might be teaching as a professor or as a graduate student. This could be industry or commercial presentations that you give, or any sort of conference presentation related to your work. So really, we're just talking about online instruction as a whole here today, which is something that it has, of course, been, I think, quite a big player in many of our lives throughout this past year or 16 months due to the pandemic, and is probably something that's here to stay, which is the reason why we chose this topic for this month's webinar. Again, helping you with that kind of industry knowledge that you can apply throughout many aspects of your academic career. So as always, I'm going to start this presentation today with going over just a brief introduction and some general basics to what webinars are, why they're important, and again, how this online instruction is something that's probably going to be staying with us. Because we want to give you as much knowledge and experience as possible that you can take with you and use to get ahead in your work, Clark and I are actually going to split the presentation today so you can hear both our experiences and thoughts and then have a discussion at the end. I'll be presenting the planning and preparation component of the webinar, and then Clark is going to jump in and talk about the presentation and promotion components of running any sort of online course, webinar, or seminar. Lastly, we're going to end with some of these essential insider tips, again, these key takeaway points from today's webinar, and we'll end with the live Q&A session. So again, if you have any questions related to the content today, no matter what they are, please input them into the Q&A function. And if you see a question that you'd like answered from a fellow peer or attendee, all you need to do is simply upvote that question, and we'll be sure to get to that question first and foremost at the end. So again, please do not be shy. The reason for running this webinar is to really answer your questions. So the first questions that I want to pose to you and to really start thinking about is the simple one. What is a webinar? What is an online course and a seminar? And of course, what are the benefits of online instruction? Something that many of us may have felt a little plagued by perhaps this past year, given that we might have not been prepared. So by definition, a webinar is a live or sometimes pre-recorded, interactive and in real-time seminar. So again, just an online course. Oftentimes these can be free or paid depending on who's running the webinar and what the content is. And the timing of webinars can be quite variable. They can be typically as short as 30 minutes or last up to an hour, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, but that's usually the general time frame. The primary purpose for online instruction, online courses, are typically teaching and learning. However, this can be extended to more commercial applications, such if you're showcasing a lab or a new product that you're trying to sell. So again, these are very wide-ranging sort of presentations. A key portion of a webinar is that typically viewers are required to register, as many of you know, since that's what you did for today's. And many webinars are now being offered on demand. And what that means is if you can't tune in live, you can simply watch the webinar later at a time that's convenient for you, which is, of course, offers you great flexibility and can reach a lot of people that way, since our schedules always can't line up, especially through different time zones. With webinars, there's a lot of versatility. You can share your screen, any sort of videos that you want to share. Of course, PowerPoint slides like you're seeing today. There's a lot of interactive and engaging features. We can chat with attendees, whether that's verbal communication or written communication. There can be breakout rooms that are hosted under the umbrella of one gigantic or larger webinar. And of course, there's a live Q&A sessions and a bundle of other features that are available on different platforms. In academia specifically, webinars are really important because they enable communication among a variety of different parties. Again, you can be having your weekly meetings with your mentor through webinars. You can have paper reading discussions, or you can have your conference presentations or your dissertation defenses. As you get more involved in your research, you might be using webinars or seminars to promote your own research, which is something that we want to really strongly encourage today. Importantly, any sort of online instruction kind of supports this concept of long distance learning and virtual meetings and scientific conferences, which has really helped break down those geographic barriers this past year, which has really been one of the primary positive things about virtual learning that I think we've all come to not only just accept, but encourage and welcome. So the primary benefits of webinars, which I think you've probably already started to see, is again, that they're quite flexible, but they're also advantageous because they're primarily interactive. And yes, there's typically a presentation, just as what I am doing now, to you to provide information. However, those real-time Q&A sessions, the chatting with the attendees, those are what make them more advantageous over other forms of learning, such as e-learning modules. So what those are simply when you read or have a presentation, but there's no interaction with the host, no interaction with your peers, and those can be a bit distracting or perhaps boring occasionally. So again, engagement is a primary benefit. Webinars are also, they disseminate information more easily into more people. So again, you can have more reach with your science, perhaps. And any of the materials that you make for webinars can always be repurposed, read by others, and reviewed by others or yourself or your peers. So again, you might be creating content for a webinar or for a class, and you might end up using that material in your conference presentation a couple months later. So again, getting started and then reusing that material is something that you can really take advantage of. So lastly, for this section, one take-home point that I want to indicate is that while webinars are very effective in promoting learning and can be quite comparable to face-to-face discussion, that's only accomplished if they're run effectively. And that's the point of our discussion today. We want to teach you and give you pointers about how to make your webinar, online course, or any sort of online presentation as effective as possible. So with that, I'm going to jump into the first primary stage of this webinar content, which is the planning and preparation stages. So again, these are tips that I think are transferable to all different types of online presentations. So again, while I'm using the word webinar quite frequently, remember that this can be put towards any other sort of content. So first step in planning and preparation is, of course, you need to decide what you're going to talk about. You need to choose an appropriate and interesting topic, something that's going to draw in attendees. First and foremost, you need to figure out who you're going to be talking to and whether or not the topic that you want to discuss is going to be appropriate for your audience. Are you talking to other researchers in your field, or are you talking to first-time students in an introductory level course? So that's a really important thing. And good topics generally inform and motivate the listeners, not only to stay with you in the presentation, but to get more engaged in that content post-webinar or post-online course. This can range for a variety of different things here, and I've suggested a few. It could be a new perspective on your research, any sort of educational material, a conference presentation, or perhaps a live demonstration of a new product if you're in the commercial or industry sector. Once you figured out your topic, thought about your audience, then you need to think a little bit more in terms of details, but specifically those that we consider the basics. So pose the certain questions to yourself, such as these. What will your webinar or course format be? Are you going to allow there to be live Q&A? Is it going to be a live webinar or a pre-recorded one? How many folks do you imagine attending your webinar, and how many do you actually think is appropriate? You may want to have a very intimate discussion on a high-level technical concept, and that means you don't want to invite the public. You don't want to have 400 people attending. Perhaps you only want to have 25. How many speakers are you going to invite? Do you want to have a host as well as a moderator and a speaker? And importantly, choosing an engaging speaker is one of the most important components of doing any sort of online instruction. You want to make sure the person that you invite is dynamic. You want to make sure that they know the material comprehensively. and of course that they're comfortable being on camera. Many webinars these days are recorded so that they can be served on demand. And that's something that you need to make sure that you ask whoever is going to be joining if they're comfortable. And finally, of course, you need to choose when you're going to have your webinar. What's the best date and time? First and foremost, be aware of the calendar. Don't overlap with holidays or any other events, whether those are local or in your own country, as well as ones that are observed by others that might be attending. One of my main suggestions is to think like your audience. When are you going to want to attend a webinar? Most likely not in the middle of the night, super early in the morning. So try to think about that when you're planning your date and time. And importantly, if you don't want to schedule your webinar so soon that people don't have a time to register for it or put it on their calendar. So you need enough time to promote your webinar, send emails indicating that you're going to be having one. And generally you want this to be at least 2 weeks time with some reminder emails so that people don't forget. Next step is choosing which webinar platform you're going to use. And there are quite a few out there these days, and there's probably always going to be more coming along. So keep your eyes open for that. Selecting the platform can be a little overwhelming, but you want to choose the one that best fits your needs. So you always want to consider the size of your audience, because there are limitations by platform. You want to decide how much money you want to spend, if any, to host your online course or webinar. And if you are in academia, you need to check with your institution. There might be recommendations or restrictions based on your university or institution, so you need to be aware of those. Importantly, however, most institutions may actually be paying for a software that you can use, so it might not be any sort of money on your end that you have to use to pay for it. I have a variety of questions listed here. I don't need, I think, to go through all of them, but again, similar questions to the slide previously. How many viewers do you expect? How many presenters are you hoping for, plan to have? What is your budget? How expensive is the platform that you're interested in? I've listed here, since you guys are going to have this website or webinar on demand, you will be able to come back to the slide and view this. I just wanted to give you some examples of available webinar platforms that you can use, and then the website URL that you can go to get interested in them or get some more information. While some of them you may have heard of, such as Zoom, which is the platform that we're on now, GoToWebinar is also quite common, as is Cisco WebEx, a little bit more in the corporate world. However, all of these webinar platforms have pros and cons. Many of them are paid services, but some of them have basic packages that are free. So just be aware of that. A lot of them have free trials and everything too. So you could take advantage of those trials if you have a one-time webinar or course that you're trying to produce. So again, this is something that you might want to delve into if you're interested in learning about different platforms, because again, all of them are different and have different advantages and disadvantages. The fourth thing that you want to consider when you're planning and prepping for any sort of online presentation is the hardware that you're going to use. And what I mean by that is the 4 basic components that you need to run an effective webinar. First and foremost, you need a computer or a laptop. You're also going to need a camera or a webcam, a microphone, and an internet connection to host your online presentation. Of these components, the microphone is something that might be coming with your laptop. However, it might be poor quality, and you may kind of need to download or implement additional software to filter through that noise. So it is worth your while to invest in a professional microphone. This is something that's really going to make your audio much cleaner. As an example, I actually do not have a professional microphone. I am using the audio directly from my laptop, and it's very likely that my audio is not as clear and crisp as Clark's, who has a headset with built-in microphone as well. Again, we can look at Clark as an example. A headset is something that is an advantage to have. It's not essential, but it offers mobility. Clark can get up and still be on the webinar and walk around, whereas me here without a headset, I'm stuck and glued in front of my computer. So again, that offers you a little bit more mobility and flexibility, and again, perhaps better audio as well. Camera is another primary component that you need to think about when you're looking to do a professional online presentation. Again, most laptops these days have built-in cameras or webcams. Again, these are typically low quality, so it is recommended to upgrade your webcam, which is something that you can do for generally a low price. However, we do understand that resources are not available to everybody. So if you do not have the ability to upgrade your webcam, try to make your laptop camera as natural as possible. So mimic how you would be if you were actually in a room face-to-face having a discussion from someone. And that typically means elevating your laptop on a stack of books or whatever it may be by about 6 inches or so, but that's something that you can play with. And then last but not least, a strong internet connection is critical. You want to use something that's probably your home internet connection or your institutional connection, something that's quite stable and strong. As a result, doing a mobile hotspot on your cell phone or any sort of public internet connection is something that you typically want to avoid. If that public internet connection goes out, you have no control in getting it back, for example. All right, the last portion of planning and preparation is, of course, what you're going to present. So the content that you're going to put forward to your attendees. So again, this is simply the presentation that you're going to give. In today's presentation, this is simply the PowerPoint slides that I'm presenting to you. My first tip is just to remember that boring is distracting. All of us are on our laptops so much as researchers these days, so we want something that's going to be really engaging in front of us. Time-wise, this means avoiding webinars that are too long. Typically, this is 1 hour. So the ideal length for a webinar is give or take around 40 minutes. And that may primarily be the content and a little bit of Q&A afterwards, or the Q&A or chatting might be filtered into that 40 minutes as a whole. Overall, you want to ensure that your presentation is focused, so you don't want to be going off on different tangents that might not be interesting to your attendees. You want to provide good, solid information. Attendees register for something, they want to get something in return, and you want to be professional, of course. Again, you are selling yourself, you are presenting yourself, whether that's your research or it's for a job interview or something like that. You always want to be professional, but also show your personality a bit as well. Ideas to keep your presentation engaging is you can always open with an icebreaker related to your topic, some beautiful photos if you do field work, or a cool video related to your lab research. While it can be difficult, especially for speakers whose first language is not English, you do want to try to keep your speech simple, direct, and to the point. Again, don't go off on tangents or use language that's not necessary. You also want to make sure that your slides are dynamic, not cluttered, and clear. Again, since we're not in person, which we very much wish we could be, you're focusing on likely what's in front of you, which are the slides that we've presented, versus staring at me. So that means that what you see in these slides should be legible. They should be not cluttered with too much text and too many figures. And they should really be just delivering one primary message or two per slide. Again, you don't want to fit in too much information at once. If you can, you want to add visually appealing images, photos, etc. to your slides. Again, you can deliver a lot of the information verbally, so it doesn't need to be on the slides themselves. And as scientists, many of us like to take the figures directly from our manuscripts and throw them into our PowerPoints. That, however, is not advised. You're probably going to want to tone down your figures. You may not need all of the super detailed axes information. You may only be talking about one trend, so you don't need to show all the comparison curves. You may need to change the colors or remove the panel lettering if you had a multi-panel figure that you're showing. So a really big point here is that you really only want to show any sort of graphics that help deliver those key educational goals, those key technical messages of your work. So again, that might be a little bit more work for you, but again, it's critical and important for how your attendees view your presentation. Finally, the last part of planning and preparation is that you should use the features that are provided by your webinar platform as much as you can. Incorporate these interactive features and these engaging components. You can poll your attendees and participants, not only on how they're enjoying the webinar, but ask questions related to content. This is something that's really important for educational courses. And use the Q&A functions when possible. Again, these could be Q&A like the function that's provided on Zoom, or it could be simply through the chat as well. So again, using different forms of media, keep the webinar interactive. It keeps the attendees with you through time. And it really, I think, makes your webinars informative and engaging. So again, just since I just said this, if you do have questions that you want us to answer, again, it can be anything related to the content today. Please put those into the Q&A. And I think I'm going to let Clark take it from here for the latter half of our content for today, which is presenting and promoting your online courses.
Nice. So I'll take our last little bit of content here. Presentation and promotion, I can't emphasize enough, only succeeds when you've done what AP just covered. So if you don't plan properly and you haven't set those things up, this isn't going to matter much. This is simply an extension of what you've already done. So presentation and promotion, a lot of the points I think you'll see here is I'm going to follow up on how you execute on the planning and preparation that you saw from AV stage, particularly when it comes to like utilizing the equipment and things like that. So we can get right into the first content AV. So I think this is obvious and I think it's cliche, but also it still can't be emphasized enough. So practice, practice, practice. The thing with a webinar is because it doesn't feel as engaging if you're not familiar with it when you first start one versus when you're in a room. When you're in a room with people, it's a little bit different. You walk past people, they're milling about, doing their things. I'm sure most, if not all of you in here have been to conferences and you know how it goes. And so there's a little bit of comfort that can be generated initially. There's a little bit of engagement by being physically there. When that's not there with a webinar, it just makes practice more important because you could put up this first point, right, for a regular old presentation at a conference or something. But when it's through video, I think it's even more important in terms of delivery, these types of things, because it's much more of a cold start. You saw when AB and I came in to this initial one, it is a little bit difficult to get going in this sort of format. So just be aware that the practice is always important, but maybe it's a little bit more important when you're going into a webinar. It's also, as you can see here, important even if it's going to be pre-recorded, because a pre-recording doesn't mean that you're going to be able to fix, any errors or snafus that you may have. So you still need to practice for a pre-recorded version. In particular, because maybe you have higher expectations of a pre-recorded because you're going into it, it's not live. So yeah, going in, practicing everything. It's about planning the details that AB said, but also about practicing what sort of content you want to cover and how you want to cover it in the context of your existing slides. The second point that we have here is this balance in a webinar, and you can see it with our series if you're someone who's come to more than one of our topics here in this LetPub series that's run a couple of years now, I think. Demonstrating the professionalism because of the content that you're probably delivering, the audience that you're delivering it to, there's a certain expectation for professionalism, although that can vary a little bit. If you're talking to students primarily, it may be a little bit different than if you're sharing research with colleagues, something like that. But regardless, either way, you do also want to have personality. You're hosting this and someone's coming to it for a certain amount of entertainment value along with information, because like it or not, there's a lot of people that can discuss these sorts of topics. You see the topics that AB and I cover in this series. They're very pertinent, but they're also covered by other organizations, by other people in terms of getting manuscripts published, evaluating journals, these types of things. These are popular topics. Information comes from a lot of sources. There's plenty of articles that you could read without having to register. And so making sure that you are setting it up so it's going to be, as AB has said multiple times, engaging and injecting some of your personality and your enthusiasm into it. AB and I love these topics, and so we hope that comes through. But that's beneficial when people are choosing where they can get their information from. Injecting some of your personality and making it an enjoyable experience is crucial. That's why webinars, podcasts, all these formats are very, very popular nowadays. Being yourself throughout, I think, is key. AB and I have a little bit different styles, and the two of us probably have very different styles from other people. But making sure that we're focused on the goal, which is to be here to communicate with you, to help you out, to give you information, to talk about topics that we genuinely find interesting. That should come through, and it shouldn't be a stoic situation, particularly when you have situations like the Q&A. AV and I, when we're delivering this material, of course, it's a bit more direct, a bit more informative, but you'll see when we get into the Q&As and any topic that we have throughout our series here, we always want to be engaging with it and for ourselves, and it becomes a bit of a discussion, and I think your audience responds well to that, regardless of whether they're students or senior investigators in your field. So we can go out to the next one, maybe. So this gets into some details, and this is something I want to remind people that comes with practice. So this webinar series that I started a while ago, it looks different from day one, and I'm sure I made a lot of errors on day one. So we're trying to prep you and give you the most information that we can, but things like this will come with experience as well in terms of interference here. Obstacles that degrade or detract from the experience are crucial to try to identify. Again, you'll learn some of them from experience. It's hard to predict them all, but we can give you some ideas here. So the first and most obvious is this audio interference. Any phones in the presentation area? I have my phone right here in case maybe AV, this is something that happens when you have guests or co-hosts, this type of thing. If you want to have your phone to see messages or something, make sure it's on silent, which is what I have mine here. Disconnecting anything loud. I have a desktop here that the fans can become quite loud on if I have them set to performance. So I always adjust them and make sure that they're not going to kick on, because I know I don't necessarily need them. The webinar is not too demanding. And I just make sure that they are not going to be flipping on and causing any sort of audio interference while we're going through. And then, of course, any other sources of noise that you can reduce in your presentation area are crucial. And that might be individual to you. It might be a different situation. Again, a lot of us are working from home during COVID. Maybe when you're in the lab, it's a little bit easier, thicker walls in a laboratory environment. Might be less of a problem. So just always be prepared to adjust when you're moving or presenting from a new space. One thing, as AV mentioned, the freedom of the headset can be quite useful. Another reason I prefer the headset quite often is because I don't have to worry about some of the ambient noise as much. The microphone on this will not pick up as if I had like a condenser microphone is good when you have it close to you still too, but they're both better than like if you have just the mic on your laptop or something, or for example, my camera has a microphone. The microphones can be good quality, but they also may pick up a lot more of the noise if you're in a home, apartment, any sort of environment like that. So be aware, maybe the headphones are a good option if you're planning to, or can't plan to avoid that type of noise. This will reduce it. Anybody that's, maybe in your household. And so then on to, of course, the other major piece of hardware, which is the camera. The nice thing is cameras are quite solid now, and they're generally affordable. I don't want to say that they're cheap or anything like that. For some people, it may be a little bit of a financial burden, but if possible, finding even a budget camera that do come in quite low, they tend to have the functions that you need in terms of autofocus. But it's important to keep in mind if you're trying to reduce any problems remaining still during the presentation. It's a little bit difficult for me, but I try to stay still. When I'm in person, I do a lot of this, a lot of hand movement and things like this. I try to reduce it a little bit in a webinar environment because it's not just for the camera, but you have to remember in a streaming situation, a lot of times you may have your platform where you're going live to YouTube, things like this as well. And in those situations, streaming demands can be quite high, and even with good internet, because it doesn't just matter on your internet, it matters on the other end as well. Sometimes those movements will not come through the same way that they would in person. So I try to reduce some of those things. Again, it's just a fine adjustment that you have from a regular presentation environment into this sort of remote virtual environment. The other is to keep your background free of clutter or use software that allows you to green screen and sort of change those filters. That's really preference, I think, on either end. I don't really think one, using the background swap or just using your regular background is matters too much either way. You can see I have my background here. This is for a lot of people. These webinars, people understand that you're just presenting from where you are, and that's totally fine. So I don't think people are too concerned about it, but of course, check out your background first. Make sure that it's not super visually distracting. Make sure your lighting is decent, of course, in that environment. And then, of course, use the filters if you want. And I think that can also be related to, again, having this consistency, picking a style that you like and trying to use all your elements to align with that style. For some people, they want to have a very formal setup. Maybe you're in a teaching environment and you want it to be very, very formal in terms of your delivery and everything. And it's not as conversational as sometimes AV and I are in this series. And so you may want to have like, just a stock filter sort of background that's a little bit more staid and plain. Whereas AV and I, this is more conversational. People are running them a bit more like a podcast, particularly when you're having guests, that type of thing. Maybe you want it to be a little bit more informal. And in particular, if you have a guest and everything, maybe people have different setups, right? So it doesn't, you can't force one of those directions anyway. And then, of course, make sure your camera's working before the webinar. AV and I always come into these webinars early in the morning, and we just make sure everything's working before we go ahead in. I always have a cloth here that I use to wipe my camera lens down really, really quickly before we get started. Anytime I do before every meeting I have, that type of thing. It's generally pretty easy. Again, these cameras are quite reliable, even though the budget ones, so you probably shouldn't have any issues, but sometimes it's actually on the software end, and sometimes something doesn't connect and it doesn't come on and you need to do a reset, and that maybe takes you 5 minutes. So prep, come in, make sure your camera's working before you go on. Another big thing is connection interference. This is particularly a concern for a lot of people depending on the equipment that you have. A lot of laptops are relatively basic, not super high processing power. A lot of people have variable internet connections that can be geographically different. My connection here has not been as good as my connection in other places. It's still completely serviceable, but I just keep that in mind when I'm doing things. So one thing I do is, of course, I think for me, Dropbox is quite ubiquitous. It's always on. I always pause that before I go in. I stop any uploads or downloads. I certainly don't leave anything that requires processing power, like tabs open, YouTube streaming, anything like that. I try to make sure that those are brought down. For me, my system's relatively powerful, so it's not as much of a concern. Previously, if I was on the laptop, it's maybe a little bit more difficult. If I wanted to have other applications open, you can just bring it up on another device, maybe your phone, iPad, tablet, that type of thing. That's always a good option. And then just to dedicate the space on your computer that you're using for the streaming, just dedicate it to the streaming. I think that's a good approach if you're able to do so. And then, of course, disconnect any non-essential devices connected to your network. It's just not having other things too. For example, I have another set of headphones here that are Bluetooth, right? And I make sure that these are never connected, because even though I may have my dedicated ones set, if these turn off automatically, there might be a noise, right, that comes through, or they might connect and all of a sudden cause issues, this type of thing. So I always make sure anything that doesn't need to be connected isn't connected, because inevitably something will go wrong if it is there. So. Record your webinar. This is a big one. I am quite absent-minded, particularly when I'm prepping for these types of things, and I've forgotten to record webinars before, that type of thing. So just give yourself a reminder. I have a sticky note. I make a big deal out of it that I need to record the webinar, or remind myself several times. But the recording is valuable. If I failed to record and you guys didn't have an on-demand recording, you'd be very upset with me. It certainly detract from your interest in coming back to the series that we have. So making sure you're careful about recording a webinar, I think is crucial. I'm usually plugged in, so I don't have to worry about charging. I suggest that you do the same if possible. But again, if you're, particularly if you have a more casual setup, maybe you are just sort of streaming from an iPad, something like that, always make sure that you have charge, that you're going to be able to complete the webinar within the time frame that you have set up, according to the equipment that you have. And again, of course, do everything as you practice. Because you're in a recording environment, you probably have things set to a bit of a schedule. As AB indicated, there's a lot of prepping that goes into it. So just go along with your recorded webinar according to that practice session, and try to enjoy it. A big thing is you've done all this stuff and you've elected to do a webinar. You've decided that this is a thing that you want to engage with because you want to communicate with others and you think they'll be interested. The worst thing you can do is not enjoy the experience yourself. If you're not going to enjoy it, I suggest you just don't do it from the beginning. Of course, there is a lot of planning that goes into it and everything, but once you've done that, and to the benefit of your audience, I think you want to relax, enjoy the whole process. Really, this is an exercise in communication. You're doing your science, you're doing the work that AB and I are doing in the publishing space, and this is an opportunity to communicate. And while there's a lot of prepping that goes in that can cause some anxiety, once we get in here, we really enjoy hosting these sessions. At the beginning of our Fridays, this once a month, it can be quite entertaining, and I always try to enjoy the process. Whenever we get done, I'm really happy to go through the questions, discuss with people. It's a really fulfilling experience. And so I encourage you to embrace that. If you find yourself worrying about it too much, not enjoying it during the process, reevaluate how you're prepping, maybe your topic, why you're doing it, so that you can enjoy it when you go through it. And of course, there's all these things that you have to do after. So you do the recording and then you need to make sure it's available. We obviously have a lot of logistics related to making sure that you all receive the link, right, for this on-demand recording. One thing that we do is sharing on YouTube. Because we want to share it on YouTube, we know it's easy to do a quick edit. We can actually clean up the audio a little bit. We can truncate the beginning and the end and make sure that we just put up a version that doesn't look sloppy, that's a little bit curated before it's delivered to someone who may want to view that recording. So. And as I just mentioned, uploading your webinar to any sharing platform that may be relevant for you. A lot of people go live to YouTube or Facebook during their presentation. Again, I think it's really important to pay attention to what AB said earlier in this session, where choosing your platform, right? This is something you want to consider, where it's going to be shared, this type of thing. But once you decided on that and you have a plan for it, make sure that you have a checklist for yourself so that it gets done. I have a checklist as soon as we're done with this webinar of updating the certificate, making sure the link gets out, all that type of thing. And then follow-up and promotion here, I think, is the last thing that we have. That goes along with what I was just mentioning with the recording. Have that checklist and make sure you don't forget these things. Checking, of course, if your attendees have any questions, we do our Q&A session, but for example, we also have our peer ref webinar hub. So we have that discussion hub. I've left the link in the chat. We'll leave it in the chat again before we go. But that's an easy way for us to allow very convenient follow-up for you all. So if you don't get something answered in the Q&A, if you think of something later, if you simply want to discuss with other attendees, maybe it's not appropriate, convenient, I would say, for the Q&A session, we offer that forum to allow you to get to us after the webinar, allowing your audience to get to you after the webinar. If it's students, I think it's often quite easy, right? Because usually the system you're operating in, perhaps it's your university system, allows for that. But definitely if that's not the case, try to figure out a good solution to let your audience get to you afterwards. I think that's crucial. Feedback and surveys are always good. You can usually do polling through a lot of software, and then providing requested materials. Again, for us, an obvious one is the certificate of completion. And it's something that we know can be important to people. And so we make a good effort to get that to them so that they get what they need out of the webinar overall and continue to come back to our series and watch all of our topics. And then, of course, promoting the webinar. As I said, a lot of times you are either going live or sharing to social media afterwards on YouTube, but promoting that anywhere you can, promoting it through other channels, using other people to amplify your voice, such as your university, can be crucial for that. Because again, there's a lot of content out there. You got to make sure you share it, that it's put in front of people, and then that if they find your work engaging, that they're going to come back to it. I think this is particularly helpful. This is why it can be particularly helpful to not do your webinars and things as a one-off, plan them into something larger, like we do this monthly series. I think that's a good way to do it, but try to plan it into something that's successive and regular. I find that when you do the promotion in that situation, it's a little bit easier to build, to snowball into more registrants, more viewers, more feedback and engagement after these webinars. So, and I think that's all we have for now. We do have these essential insider tips. I think we're sort of just going to let you guys take a look at this. If we have some questions, we can get started right on those, and then maybe go through this list to summarize before we let you all go.
Yeah, thank you, Clark, for excellent insights. We actually do have some really good questions so far in the Q&A, and many of them are about kind of technical concepts and details, which we didn't go into too much detail in the actual content presentation. So it's wonderful that these questions are asked. And Clark, you're kind of the tech guru out of the two of us. So the first one's about kind of details related to some of the backgrounds that people use. Sometimes there's shiny edges on people when you move, things like that. Do you know what causes that, or how kind of issues like that can be avoided when people are doing webinars themselves?
Yeah, so a lot of times that's camera quality. So a lot of times when people are on their laptops and I think they're moving around and stuff, you get a little bit of the lag effect, and it causes some problems. I think again, it doesn't have to be an expensive camera. I think a lot of like the budget cameras that you could look up on any consumer site and pick up easily, a Logitech, something like that. They take care of a lot of issues with that sort of thing, because a lot of people are using their laptop camera and it doesn't look good. It gets distorted at some point, particularly if you're trying to sit back like I'm doing now and give a presentation from a relaxed posture. Like if I had a laptop one on now on the scene that I have here, you would get that sort of effect where there'd be very low clarity, reflections, that type of thing. The other big thing, of course, if you think that there's reflection, that type of stuff, is the lighting. Is pretty crucial, specifically to the backgrounds. When you see that in the background, it's because the background software, when you're using like that background removal tool and then doing like an overlay, like the software created green screen, not actually using a green screen, you just can't move. That's the whole point. It's doing edge detection. It's finding the edge and then removing it behind you. If you start moving, that edge has to try to move with you, and it's just never going to be very accurate. So if you're using background removal tools, don't plan on moving much. Okay, you're going to have to remain really still in those situations. If you want a background, then you have to actually get a green screen, which are surprisingly not expensive. We actually have one, and I've used them for presenting at conferences remotely. And so you can get an actual green screen, and you'll find that the effect in that situation is much better. Or again, just do what we do and just set up a decent looking background. Like what you or I have, a sort of office environment. And I think that works just as well. And then you don't have to worry about those sort of distortions. But yeah, in that case, it's very much a limitation of the software.
Yeah, virtual backgrounds do work. But I guess I'm with you. Just having a somewhat professional background is a good idea. I mean, as you can see behind me, I have a very bright window behind me in my house, and the sun came out, and I can't really change that unless I got darker shades or something like that, so there wouldn't be this kind of very, very bright light coming from behind me. Clark, for example, he has his set up so that there is no window behind him, so he's already eliminated the possibility of what's happening to me this morning, which is a pretty smart move. So again, just getting used to setting up your room behind you is a good way. This kind of is a segue into, I think, another question that we have, which is really just kind of clarifying what we mean by clutter in the background of the visuals that we have here. And that's simply just that there is not a lot of objects or things that are behind you that can be quite distracting to the viewers of your webinar that are watching you speak. So again, you just want to have something pretty professional. I think having a clean space is important. You know, if we were looking into the background of the room that Clark's in right now, and, you know, he had clothes all over the floor or something, you know, that kind of gives us an unprofessional view of perhaps of Clark. And, that's of course not the case, but that is just something about being tidy and clean and making sure that there's not too many distracting objects right behind you. Again, focus on yourself, make you as the presenter, first and foremost in the presentation, and minimize kind of that background distracting objects. That's what we meant by keeping your background free of clutter.
Yeah, sure. And it's like Evie says, some just general neatness is crucial, but it's also like the table behind me that I have, the small coffee table there. I usually have that like piled with books and papers and things like that. And it's not necessarily like that I'm worried about someone thinking I'm a bit of a slob for having stuff all over, because it's not really a mess. It's just materials, but I don't need those work materials out when I'm showing this, because it's just distracting to have a lot of busyness around the room. The space I have is already a little bit busy. That you're looking out on. I have the bookcases there and everything, but just making sure the surfaces don't have stuff spilling all over them, because again, the visual clutter can just be a little bit distracting, and I want to be in the forefront of the sort of imagery that I'm projecting.
I do also want to just mention that it is totally okay to not want to show the background that you're in. You're very much allowed to have a virtual background, or encouraged to do that, really whatever makes you feel comfortable. Some people don't like the viewers being able to see where they are broadcasting from. That can be considered some sort of invasion of privacy. So you should feel totally comfortable in having a green screen or doing a different sort of background if that makes you feel comfortable and allows you to communicate virtually with others. So feel free to do what works best for you.
Yeah, and do it to like fit the style of what you're trying to do. Like if you have a casual webinar, just have fun with the background. That's fine. There's no like hard and fast rule. And in that case, like if you're using a fun background, virtual background, people know it's a virtual background. And the fact that there's like the, those little lighting distortions and stuff doesn't really matter, right? Because that's the whole point. It's like a fun virtual background. Just go with it. If you have a background like this, again, if you're doing something casual, a podcasty type feel, a vibe, you're doing like interviews with people and maybe they're gonna have a different background from you, don't worry too much about the background that you're in. It's okay to be casual. It's okay to be real. You don't have to feel like you need to sanitize it or make it completely artificial. That's totally fine. Just do it from where you are and be authentic. As long as that goes with the style that you're doing, your style isn't to be very sanitized with your presentation or the material that you're doing, go with it. As long as there's consistency between all the factors of your webinar, there's no wrong way. There's no, oh, it's too formal. Oh, it's too casual. There's no rule as long as there's consistency.
I think another question that we have here is another technical question. So Clark, I'm going to throw this one at you again, because you might have a little bit more knowledge than me on this topic. I actually don't quite have quite a depth on this. Have you ever been to a webinar or seen a webinar with like a 4D PowerPoint presentation or any sort of kind of upper level content?
I have not. I am not familiar with this 4D. I know Cinema 4D and using 4D overlays for backgrounds is a thing, but I've never seen a 4D PowerPoint presentation. So I think what I'll say for this one is take a look at our link that we left for our PureRef discussion hub. I'll see if I can find any more information for you. It might be an interesting discussion topic for us, but maybe I'm just reading it wrong as well. But I'm not familiar with the 4D for the PowerPoint, so I'll have to look into that and address it. And that gives me an idea for the discussion hub. I will go in and see if I can find any resources. Maybe I think you did a great job of listing software and these types of things for like the platforms that people may want to decide to adopt for their webinars, but I'll see if there's any presentation tools, anything else like that that may be conducive to webinars, and we'll be sure to add those resources to our discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we apologize that we aren't quite as up on the technology as perhaps we should be to answer that question. But again, please input any questions like that. we're not the only resources. That's the beauty of being able to use the PureRef platform, is that you can post questions just like this, and somebody listening right now or who's just generally on PureRef might have a really quick, great answer for you. So again, you can chat with others and they can be extremely beneficial for you to learn the answers to the questions, or perhaps have a longer discussion with others, in addition to, of course, attending this webinar right now. I did have one question for you, Clark, or maybe something that we can discuss. Of the list of webinars that I did write down, I didn't kind of give or elaborate on much of that information. Do you know any platforms that are strictly freeware that our attendees could use?
I think GoToPresent does have a freeware option. I can add others. I'm not sure that any of the freeware options are the most desirable. The thing that I would focus on, if that's an issue, if you are at an institution, try to find out, use their platform. Most times you have like an online learning platform, and using that would definitely be your best approach. Most of the platforms have a freeware version. It's just limited in the access that you have. In particular, what you're going to see is it's more of a meeting setup. It isn't the webinar. Usually the webinar aspect is which it doesn't differ that much. The webinar just gives you the extra tools, which I think are desirable. We obviously use them, and we would never not use the webinar version. But certainly if you're starting off, you can use the meeting. You can use any sort of meeting. You can use Google Meet. It's fine to do those, particularly when you're starting out, particularly when your viewer base is small. For us, we get like a big user base and we need to be able to moderate. That's a crucial aspect of it. And once you have to start moderating because you don't know everybody in your audience and you're not sure if it could just be trusted to broadcast and hope everybody does what they're supposed to, then you might need to move away from the freeware option and into dedicated webinar software. Also, when your numbers get to a certain degree, because usually meetings are capped relatively low and webinars are what really allow you to expand. So we can add those as resources as well. But yeah, generally all the options that you listed, I think you can do it as meetings. And that starts you off in the free sort of bracket.
Great. Well, do you have any questions or comments that you want to make? We're coming up on the suggested 1 hour webinar duration that we talked about here for best practices. I know we have this list of tips here that we've had up for attendees, but we've had it up for a while, so I'm not sure we need to go through them in any extreme detail. But do you have any comments?
One thing I really wanted to emphasize, this is definitely a good way to cap it, and it goes along a bit with this tech assistants are worth it at the bottom. My overall is, if you're thinking about doing a webinar, I would strongly suggest that you think about doing it with someone, one other person, or collaborating in some way. In science, you're always collaborating. This should be no different. But I think a lot of the things that we talked about, engagement, preparing, paying attention to the logistical details, it becomes so much more effective if you have two people, if you bring someone else in. Right? The webinar that we're doing, you have the ability for me to, quite often you're delivering a lot of the content. I'm able to handle some of the moderation and just make sure those details go smoothly. That would be just a headache for one person to do alone. And then also, again, this engagement, the idea of this being an entertaining aspect. Certainly, if you're doing it by yourself, you could have guests. That's also something I would encourage. It's always good to have someone else. But if you can do it with two hosts, if you can have a partner for this, I think you will find the experience not just more effective, but more enjoyable. I certainly did not like this as much when I started the series and I was on my own. It was fun. I was excited about it. I was excited to talk about these topics. But when you came on and started doing them with me, it made it more fun. I felt like the audience enjoyed it more. Our numbers went up. So I think it's clear that people enjoyed it more, found it more engaging. That would be my number one. If you just want my opinion, I would say do everything you can to bring someone else on board and work in a team to deliver communications in this format. I think it's much more fulfilling and effective.
I think that's great. I think that's a great point to end on. Like you say, science is collaborative, so online communication, presentation should be as well. Yeah, so I think with that, we can do some quick wrap up here.
Sure.
We did have some questions about the certificates. Again, everybody who did attend today will receive a certificate about 24 hours or so after this presentation in a follow-up email. So if that is something that is of interest to you, just keep on lookout for that. And you do always receive certificates with any of our webinars that we do. So if that's something that is, yeah, again, of interest to you, join us for each month's webinar, and you'll always be getting a certificate for your needs.
One last housekeeping item I just wanted to mention as well. Most of you are viewing this through PRF, and so we did leave the link. Go to the hub as well. We always remind people of that for each session. But I also wanted to mention, since we're on the topic of webinars, it does look like PRF in the future may have an upcoming feature where webinars will be there. There'll be possible video content sharing in some format on PRF. That will be something new. It's a little bit under construction right now, but please pay attention to that when you're on the PRF platform. Be on the lookout for that. There may be opportunities where some of you who want to take these tips and strategies that we've given you, if you're looking for a place, a platform to pick it up and get started, PRF may have that option for you in the near future. So be on the lookout. Once that's out, of course, we'll definitely announce it and cover it in our next webinar, because I think anybody that came into our session today, relatively small number, you're also probably very much interested in these webinars. And so that may be something that could be extremely helpful for you to get started. So be on the lookout for that on PRF in the future.
All right, I think that's it. I guess we want to thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you for your excellent questions. Again, if you have more questions or want to keep chatting with us, you can feel free to visit PRF and go to our discussion hub and just comment and chat, both with us and with the fellow peers and colleagues that are in there as well. With that, I hope everybody has a fantastic weekend or Friday or wherever you are, whatever time it is. A great rest of your day.
So see you next month.